All right, let's just get right into it. We have this tendency to look back at history and see the Hollywood version. You know, the noble knights, the wise kings, the cool, shadowy heroes. But today, we're going to peel all of that back and look at the grim, messy, and frankly fascinating truth about how power and violence actually worked. And this quote, it just nails the heart of where we're starting. We're kicking things off with one of the most romanticized figures in all of history, just to see how wrong we've got it. So let's talk about the medieval assassin. Seriously, forget everything you've seen in movies and video games. This wasn't some cool career path. It was pretty much the last stop on the life went horribly wrong train. Yeah, the myth is this highly trained, elite shadow warrior, right? The reality was, well, a lot sadder. It was usually some disgraced soldier, an ex-thief, or just a guy so broke he'd take a few coins to solve some nobleman's problem. Honestly, if you owned even a single goat, you were already in management. You hired assassins. You didn't become one. And the day-to-day, it was bleak. Let's be real, the benefits package was awful. No pension, no glory, no weekends off, and you can absolutely forget about a dental plan. If you actually succeeded, your whole job was to vanish without a trace. You weren't a hero. You weren't even a famous villain. You were just a scary footnote that nobody wanted to talk about. And what about your gear? Oh man, no enchanted blades or cool gadgets here. Your toolkit was basically whatever you could steal or hide. A rusty dagger, maybe a bit of rope if you're feeling fancy. You were expected to work miracles with like a spoon and a prayer. But here's the real kicker, the stakes. If you messed up, you weren't just fired. You instantly became a liability. The same guy who hired you would be the first one to put a contract out on you. Your career would end very publicly, probably in a really painful way, as a warning to the next poor soul who thought about taking the job. Okay, so let's scale up. We're moving from a lone killer scrabbling for coins to violence on a royal, empire-shaping scale. I want you to meet Olympias, a woman who didn't just hire assassins, she wielded power with her own brand of terrifying ambition. So who was Olympias? Well, before she was queen, she was a princess from Epirus, and she was deeply into these ecstatic rituals and prophecy. Ancient writers claimed she literally kept sacred snakes in her rooms. Now, to her friends, this made her seem divine. To her enemies, it made her seem incredibly dangerous. Her life was basically a masterclass in ruthless political maneuvering. She marries Philip of Macedon, gives birth to a legend, Alexander, and then suddenly her whole position is at risk. When her son's claim to the throne is threatened, she gets exiled. But Philip's assassination, that wasn't the end of her story. Oh no. For her, that was the beginning of her comeback. She didn't just return. She returned with a vengeance. And this is where you see just how brutal she could be. Her main rival, Philip's new wife, had to be eliminated. The stories say Olympias made it a deeply personal and public humiliation. See, she understood something fundamental about power. In a royal palace, a rival's child, no matter how small, represents a future war. She was done playing defense. Years later, long after Alexander's death, she made one last, bold play for power. But this time, her luck ran out. Her enemies, led by the general Cassander, finally cornered her. She was besieged, captured, and in the end, handed over to be executed by the families of the very people she had killed. A brutal end for a brutal ruler. Okay, so we've seen the personal violence of a queen. Now let's zoom out and look at structural power. How a building itself can become this myth of control and fear. For that, we're going to ancient Crete and the legend of the Minotaur. The legend is famous, right? A half-man, half-bull monster trapped in a giant maze. But here's a thought. What if the monster wasn't a creature at all? What if the real monster was the building? The archaeology at the Palace of Knossos points to something just like that. The myth gives us this simple, scary monster story. But the reality? It's so much more complex and honestly way more impressive. The palace wasn't a prison. It was the absolute beating heart of the Minoan civilization, a massive hub for culture, religion, and the economy. I mean, this place was an architectural marvel. We're talking flushing toilets and multi-story apartment blocks thousands of years before the Romans were doing it. If you were an ancient visitor, walking through its twisting corridors and countless rooms would have felt totally disorienting, maybe even magical. The building was the labyrinth. So, where does the bull fit in? Well, the most famous art at Knossos shows athletes leaping over charging bulls. This was almost certainly a sacred ritual. The bull wasn't some monster hiding in a basement. It was a powerful symbol of nature that they celebrated openly. The Minotaur myth was probably just how later Greeks tried to make sense of this powerful, kind of alien culture they'd heard stories about. All right, one last jump in scale. We've gone from a person to a palace. Now let's talk about the industrial level power needed to bring down entire cities. Welcome to the terrifying world of ancient siege engineering. Siege warfare was really just weaponized physics. You had your classic battering ram for just brute forcing gates. You had the catapult, which used tension to fling rocks and attack both the walls and the morale of the people inside. And then you had the king. The trebuchet. This thing was a majestic, terrifying machine. It used a massive counterweight to just swing an arm and launch projectiles in this huge high arc. We're talking a 300-pound stone sailing over a city wall. When a trebuchet showed up on the battlefield, it was basically a statement that said, "Your walls mean nothing to me." But not all the best tactics were allowed. Sapping or undermining was this dark art. You'd dig a tunnel right under an enemy wall, prop it up with wooden beams, and then pack the tunnel with flammable stuff, like pig fat. Then you'd light it on fire. The forts burn, the tunnel collapses, and a huge chunk of the fortress wall just crumbles to the ground. Terrifyingly effective. And you have to remember, a siege was as much a psychological game as a physical one. Attackers didn't just launch stones. They launched severed heads to shatter morale. They launched diseased corpses over the walls to spread plague and panic. The goal wasn't just to break the walls. It was to break the will of everyone inside. So, we've gone from the desperate assassin to the vengeful queen to the architects of citywide destruction. What's the common thread here? What's the through line? It really boils down to this. Whether it's one person with a dagger just trying to survive, or a whole army with a trebuchet trying to conquer a city, the tools and the scale of violence are completely different. But that fundamental human driver, that relentless pursuit of power, security, and dominance, that just echoes on through history. And that leaves us with one last big thought to chew on. Today, our tools for influence and destruction are infinitely more sophisticated. But are the reasons we use them, fear, ambition, survival, are those motives really all that different from those of a medieval assassin or an ancient queen? It's a question worth thinking about.